Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to talk about something that sounds dramatic, almost comical. Why India slaps Donald Trump every time he comes to India. Of course, I don't mean a literal slap. What I'm talking about is the cultural, political, and psychological slap, the reality check that India delivers when global leaders, especially Trump, step onto its soil. You see, a slap is not always an act of violence. It's a wake-up call, a reminder that no matter how powerful you think you are, you cannot ignore the voice, the pride, and the complexity of a nation like India. And that's where this story begins, at the intersection of ego, power, and identity. When we talk about India's political pride in the context of Donald Trump's visits, it is important to understand that India is not just another country hosting a foreign leader. It is one of the world's oldest civilizations, the world's largest democracy, and a nation that carries deep historical memories of colonial rule. For India, every interaction with a powerful figure like Trump is more than just about handshakes, photo ops, or joint statements. It is about sending a clear reminder to the world that India does not compromise its sovereignty or bow down to external pressure. This is why many observers describe India's response to Trump as a symbolic slap. It is not about disrespecting him personally, but about reinforcing the idea that India is no longer a passive player in global politics. Trump, during his presidency, was known for his bold, sometimes brash, style of diplomacy. He often approached international relations with a transactional mindset. If the United States gives something, it expects something bigger in return. But when this approach met India, it collided with a nation that sees itself not as a subordinate, but as an equal. India has a long tradition of resisting domination, whether it was colonial empires in the past or superpowers in the modern world. For Indians, even symbolic gestures of superiority from outsiders can feel like an insult to national dignity. So when Trump tried to project himself as the bigger partner in the U.S.-India relationship, India instinctively pushed back. This pushback is not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it is subtle, through carefully chosen words in joint statements, through trade negotiations that refuse to give the U.S. an easy win, or through diplomatic silence when Trump expected applause. Other times, it is more visible, as when Indian leaders highlight their own achievements and priorities during Trump's visits, making it clear that India has its own path and will not simply echo Washington's agenda. In both cases, the underlying message remains the same. India's pride and independence are non-negotiable. What makes this dynamic even more interesting is how the Indian public reacts. Indian citizens are deeply aware of their country's growing global influence, and they do not want their leaders to appear submissive before a figure like Trump. The pride of the people feeds into the pride of the political establishment. Every time Trump visited, Indians scrutinized how their leaders carried themselves, and any sign of weakness would be criticized harshly. This public expectation acted like a shield, ensuring that India always stood tall. So, when we say India slaps Trump, we are really talking about this protective pride. It is the slap of history reminding the world that India has risen from centuries of struggle. It is the slap of democracy reminding foreign leaders that Indian voices matter. And most importantly, it is the slap of sovereignty, showing that no matter who comes from outside, India's identity, dignity, and independence will always come first. When Donald Trump comes to India, one of the most striking tensions that emerge is the cultural clash between his personality and India's traditions. Trump is larger than life, outspoken, and often unfiltered in his words and gestures. He thrives on showmanship, spectacle, and self-promotion. India, on the other hand, is a land where culture has always been deeply intertwined with humility, symbolism, and respect for traditions. When these two worlds meet, sparks are bound to fly, and those sparks often take the shape of what can be described as a symbolic slap. Trump's way of speaking is one of the biggest contrasts. He likes to make bold claims, exaggerate numbers, and focus on his own role in making things great. In India, leaders are expected to show reverence toward history, community, and collective identity. Even when they are powerful, they often frame themselves as servants of the people or guardians of tradition. This difference in tone becomes very obvious when Trump takes the stage. His self-centered approach feels alien in a country where humility, even if performed, is considered a sign of strength. Indians notice this contrast, and rather than being impressed by his bravado, they often interpret it as arrogance. Another layer of this cultural clash is visible in how Trump perceives crowds and adoration. For him, a massive rally or stadium event is proof of popularity and power. When he visited India, he was given grand receptions, like the Namaste Trump event in Ahmedabad. But here lies the irony. While Trump may have seen this as an endorsement of himself, Indians viewed it as their own hospitality, their cultural way of honoring a guest. In Indian tradition, guests are treated like gods, and offering a warm welcome does not mean surrendering pride or admiration. Many Indians, in fact, saw Trump's tendency to treat such gestures as personal victories as a misunderstanding of their cultural intent. This misunderstanding itself was a slap, exposing the gap between his expectations and India's true values. Trump's bluntness also clashed with India's subtle, layered style of communication. In Indian culture, diplomacy is often expressed indirectly, with careful choice of words, metaphors, and respectful silence. Trump's habit of being direct, sometimes to the point of rudeness, often felt abrasive. While he may not have realized it, many Indians perceived his manner as dismissive of the complexity and dignity of their traditions. To them, his straightforwardness was not refreshing but jarring, another cultural collision that reminded India of the importance of its own ways. Even in symbolic gestures, the cultural divide was clear. Trump's awkwardness with Indian customs, like mispronouncing words or struggling with rituals, often made headlines. While Indians are forgiving of mistakes from foreigners, they are also quick to laugh at insensitivity. Humor, satire, and memes became tools for the public to process this cultural mismatch. Every slip was turned into a collective joke, which itself became a soft slap, a way of showing that India's culture is too vast and too nuanced to be simplified or misunderstood. Ultimately, the clash between Trump's personality and India's traditions highlighted two very different ways of being powerful. Trump believed power was about dominance, attention, and loudness. India showed, through its culture, that true power can also be quiet, dignified, and deeply rooted in tradition. Every visit became a stage for this contrast, and in that contrast lay the subtle slap of cultural pride. When Donald Trump came to India, one of the biggest points of tension was economics. Trump was known for approaching international relationships as business deals. He looked at countries through the lens of trade deficits, tariffs, and who is winning in the numbers game. For him, every partnership had to prove its worth in profit and loss terms. India, however, does not see itself as a customer or a client. It sees itself as a sovereign nation with its own priorities, its own terms, and its own definition of fairness. This is where the economics slap comes in. Every time Trump tried to push for quick wins in trade, India reminded him that it was not going to bend simply to please the United States. During his presidency, Trump often complained that India was not giving America a fair deal. He called India the tariff king, pointing out the high duties imposed on American goods like Harley, Davidson motorcycles, and agricultural products. In Trump's style, these complaints were loud, public, and delivered as if India was obligated to fix them immediately. But India responded in its own way, calmly, firmly, and without giving in. For India, tariffs are not just about economics. They are about protecting local industries, farmers, and livelihoods. To simply drop them because America demanded it would mean ignoring its own people. So instead of bowing down, India stood its ground, signaling that it would not compromise its economic sovereignty. This firmness often frustrated Trump, who was used to leveraging America's power to get what he wanted. He liked to portray himself as a tough negotiator, but India's refusal to yield became a quiet embarrassment for him. For example, when Trump threatened higher tariffs on Indian goods in retaliation, India responded with reciprocal measures rather than concessions. This tit-for-tat approach sent a strong message. India was ready to engage, but not at the cost of its dignity or self-interest. In effect, this was the slap, the refusal to be bullied into an unequal agreement. What made the situation even more symbolic was how India handled Trump's public style. Instead of reacting emotionally to his complaints, Indian leaders maintained a steady, diplomatic tone. They neither insulted him nor openly criticized him, but they also never gave him the win he was looking for. This subtle firmness frustrated Trump even more because it denied him the dramatic victories he loved to showcase. While he wanted headlines about how he fixed trade imbalances, India made sure that the reality on the ground was different. Deals could only move forward if they were fair to both sides. For ordinary Indians, this economic stance became a matter of pride. People celebrated the fact that their country did not get swayed by Trump's pressure. In a world where smaller nations often feel forced to follow the demands of bigger powers, India's refusal to compromise reinforced its image as a rising global force. This slap, therefore, was not just against Trump's economic tactics, but against the very idea that India could be pushed around in the global marketplace. Every time Trump raised the issue of trade deficits or tariffs, India's response was the same: measured, confident, and rooted in self-respect. This repeated cycle of pressure and refusal became symbolic of the economic reality check India gave Trump. It showed that while America might still be a superpower, India was no longer a junior partner. Instead, it was a strong player determined to protect its own economic future, and in the grand stage of global politics, that stance was the loudest slap of all. One of the most fascinating aspects of Donald Trump's visits to India was not just what happened in political meetings or trade negotiations, but how the Indian public reacted. In today's world, perception is as powerful as policy, and India's public perception of Trump became its own form of resistance. Unlike in the United States, where Trump's base either adored him or despised him in bitter political battles, India's response leaned toward humor, satire, and irony. This collective reaction itself acted as a symbolic slap, showing that no matter how grand Trump tried to appear, the people of India would bring him back down to earth with their wit. Trump thrives on image. He values crowds, applause, and the sense of being larger than life. When he came to India, he was greeted with massive rallies, cultural shows, and carefully staged events. But while Trump saw these as proof of his charisma, many Indians saw them as a spectacle of hospitality, nothing more. The Indian public has a long history of turning politics into humor, and Trump provided endless material. His mispronunciations, his exaggerated numbers, and his awkward attempts at fitting into Indian customs became instant subjects of memes and jokes. The laughter of millions of people across social media platforms was not cruel, but it was powerful. It turned Trump's attempt at grandeur into entertainment, and in doing so, it reminded him and the world that Indians are not easily dazzled. Public perception in India is also tied to pride. Indians value leaders who command respect internationally while maintaining dignity. Trump's loud style, his focus on himself, and his transactional tone often clashed with this expectation. Instead of being impressed, many Indians viewed him as someone who did not fully grasp the depth of India's culture and politics. This skepticism showed in the way people reacted online and in everyday conversations. Trump was not hated, but he was not revered either. Instead, he became a figure to be analyzed, joked about, and in subtle ways mocked. That mockery was a collective slap, one that told him he could not control how he was seen. What makes the Indian public's response unique is that it is both playful and sharp. In other countries, criticism of Trump often came with anger. In India, the weapon of choice was humor. Satirical cartoons, trending hashtags, and viral videos captured every awkward moment of his trips. This light-hearted resistance sent a deeper message. India would not give Trump the satisfaction of being taken too seriously. By laughing at him, Indians were refusing to put him on the pedestal he so badly desired. In a democracy as vast and noisy as India's, public opinion matters. Leaders know they cannot ignore how people feel, because perception shapes legitimacy. Every time Trump visited, the laughter, memes, and witty critiques became part of the national conversation. It was as if the people were saying, "You may be powerful in America, but here you are just another guest, and we will decide how to remember you." That decision, collectively, was to remember him with humor rather than awe. This public response became India's soft power slap. It was not aggressive, not hostile, but deeply effective. By refusing to be starstruck, by turning Trump's image into a subject of satire, the Indian public showed that real power lies in perception. And in that arena, India had the upper hand every time. Every time Donald Trump set foot in India, something symbolic unfolded that went beyond political statements or economic debates. The encounter itself became a kind of slap, not of hostility but of symbolism, showing the contrast between his expectations and India's identity. Symbolism matters deeply in India, a country where history, rituals, and gestures often carry more weight than words. So when Trump expected admiration or deference, what he often received instead was a subtle reminder that India would define the terms of the relationship, not him. This symbolic slap was not just about Trump as a person, but about what he represented, the idea that power alone could command respect. Take, for example, the grand rallies. When Trump came to India, he was welcomed with massive crowds and colorful cultural events. On the surface, it looked like a perfect stage for him, a man who loves spectacle. But for India, these events were not about Trump's glory. They were about showcasing Indian hospitality and culture. The symbolism was clear. While Trump might see the crowds as his personal victory, India was using the same moment to remind the world of its own diversity, traditions, and strength. The slap came in the disconnect. Trump thought it was about him, but in truth, it was about India. Another symbolic layer lies in how India positioned itself diplomatically. Trump prided himself on being a deal-maker, someone who could walk into any situation and bend it to his will. But during his visits, India always made sure that any agreements signed, any joint statements released, reflected its own interests and independence. The symbolism here was powerful. The world might expect India to play along with America's agenda, but India would only agree to what matched its sovereignty. Each carefully worded phrase, each moment where India avoided echoing Trump's rhetoric, was like a subtle slap, reminding him that he was not in control of the narrative. Even small details carried symbolic weight. Trump often struggled with pronouncing Indian names or understanding cultural references, and while Indians laughed at these slips, they also took pride in how their culture seemed too vast and too complex to be simplified for foreign leaders. It was a reminder that India is not a backdrop for someone else's show. It is a stage of its own. The symbolism of this dynamic is that India's culture humbles even the most confident figures, delivering a slap without ever raising a hand. The symbolism also extended to the way India presented itself as a global power. In Trump's worldview, relationships were often transactional. What can you give me, and what do I get in return? India, however, presented itself as a partner, not a subordinate. This was not just politics. It was symbolic of a new global order, one where old power equations no longer applied. The very act of standing shoulder to shoulder rather than one above the other became its own form of symbolic defiance. In all these ways, the slap was never literal. It was symbolic, woven into India's traditions, diplomacy, and identity. For Trump, who thrived on dominance, the most frustrating thing was perhaps this: India never had to insult him directly. The culture, the people, the gestures, and the diplomacy all carried the message that he could not bend India to his narrative, and that quiet, dignified symbolism was the strongest slap of all. Whenever Donald Trump visited India, the underlying message from New Delhi to Washington was always clear: India is not a follower, but an equal player on the global stage. This is the final and perhaps most important slap, because it speaks not only to Trump, but to the world at large. For decades, international politics has been shaped by a hierarchy where the United States was at the top, and countries like India were expected to align, adjust, or adapt. But in recent years, India has been steadily rewriting that story. Each of Trump's visits became an opportunity for India to demonstrate that it was no longer content to be seen as a junior partner. It was ready to assert itself as an independent voice in global affairs. Trump's political style was rooted in a world view where America came first. He often expected other nations to fall in line with his priorities, whether on trade, defense, or foreign policy. But when he dealt with India, he encountered a different reality. India's leaders made it clear that while they valued the relationship with the United States, they would not compromise their autonomy. This was visible in areas like defense, where India continued to purchase weapons from Russia despite U.S. pressure, or in international forums where India maintained its own stance on issues like climate change and regional security. By refusing to simply echo American policies, India sent a global message. It had its own agenda, its own red lines, and its own vision of leadership. This message resonated strongly with the Indian public, who saw Trump's visits as a stage where their country could showcase its rising power. For ordinary Indians, it was not about Trump himself, but about what his presence symbolized. If the leader of the most powerful nation in the world had to come to India, attend Indian ceremonies, and negotiate on Indian terms, then it was proof of how far the country had come. Every handshake, every joint press conference, every carefully crafted moment was charged with the symbolism of equality. This was not just diplomacy, it was a declaration of status. The slap, then, was not about rejecting Trump personally, but about rejecting the outdated idea that the U.S. could dictate terms. India's actions showed the world that global politics was moving toward multipolarity, where no single nation could dominate unchallenged. Whether it was through its stance on trade, its military independence, or its cultural pride, India positioned itself as a force that demanded respect, and every time Trump walked away without getting the kind of easy victory he wanted, that message became louder. In this way, India's response to Trump was more than just a bilateral interaction. It was a performance on the global stage, witnessed by other nations who were also seeking to balance their relationships with America. By standing firm, India not only protected its own interests, but also set an example of how middle powers could assert themselves without fear. The global message was unmistakable: India is not here to follow, it is here to lead alongside others. And that act of asserting equality was the most powerful slap of all.